So tell us a little bit about the definition behind what was talking about tonight. It was liberty and justice for some. Could you go into detail about that and what the title is significant for you?
Sure. I mean, it was essentially a book. It was from a book that I wrote in 2011 that grew out of the fact that the country's most powerful factions over the last decade or so have committed the most egregious crimes: the construction of a worldwide torture regime, eavesdropping systematically on the conversations of Americans without the warrants required by criminal law, abducting and rendering people, and then the systemic fraud that precipitated the 2008 financial crisis, have engaged in these egregious crimes without any form of criminal accountability, investigation, basically a blanket license of impunity for those who wield the greatest power. At the very same time that the United States has maintained and built the world's largest penal state, where more people are imprisoned in our nation's prison system than any other country in the world, including countries with far greater populations, and this disparity of extreme mercilessness and harshness of punishment for ordinary citizens who engage even in trivial offenses, juxtaposed with this license of impunity for the most powerful people who commit the most egregious crimes, is really a complete renunciation of what the rule of law is intended to secure.
So you talked about also one of the things, a quote from John Adams you mentioned a lot, was a nation of laws and not of men. Maybe could you tell us about the different extent of that behind the different war on whistleblowers and the Patriot Act and all these different egregious laws that have occurred on that, and how that quote still is relevant today?
Well, the idea of a rule of law as opposed to a rule of men was supposed to be that a society that lives under the rule of men means that those who wield the greatest power can impose their will and engage in any form of self-aggrandizing conduct without constraints or limitations of any kind. And that was exactly the kind of monarchical society that the founders had waged war to free themselves from, and were therefore searching for an alternative. And the alternative they found was this idea of rule of law, which is that even the most powerful men are subjected to the same set of rules to which everybody on equal terms is bound. And so what you look at in the United States is not just a violation of that principle, but an explicit repudiation of it. And the war on whistleblowers is a great example, because if you are somebody who discloses secret classified information that undermines the agenda of the United States government or exposes criminality or embarrasses political officials, you are prosecuted to extreme degrees. But if you are a political official who leaks classified information designed to glorify the president or advance the agenda of the U.S. government, you are never prosecuted or subjected to any form of accountability. And what this reveals, and there's countless examples that do, is that criminal punishment is determined not by what you do, but who you are.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned also one of the good signs about what's going on here was the Rand Paul filibuster, which I just checked is still continuing after I think about 8 hours or so. It's still going on now. If you have any thoughts on that, or any about what's going on with that lately, and his objection to John Brennan being confirmed as the head of the CIA.
Well, in one sense, it's really encouraging, and in one sense, it's really dispiriting. It's dispiriting in the sense that what's motivating the filibuster is the fact that the Obama administration essentially finally said, after refusing to answer, that it believes the president has the authority even to target U.S. citizens on U.S. soil for assassination. And it's also motivated by this extreme secrecy surrounding the drone program, where the Obama administration won't even reveal the legal memoranda that purports to define this power, which is a form of keeping a regime of secret laws from the population. And it's kind of dispiriting to see that the person who has to lead this campaign is not a Democrat or a liberal or progressive or any of the senators pretending to believe in these values during the Obama administration, but this junior first-term Tea Party conservative Republican from Kentucky, who that same progressive movement widely scorns. But it's encouraging in the sense that at least somebody's doing it for exactly the right reasons, and it has provoked some Democratic support from senators like Ron Wyden and Mark Udall, and then some Republican support as well from Mike Lee and a couple of others. So although it's far smaller than it ought to be, and although it's far less galvanizing of the kind of backlash that you think ought to be triggered from the revelation that the Obama administration thinks it has this power, at least there's some ripple of resistance, even in the halls of the Senate, and that's something new and better than we've seen over the last 10 years.
Talking about those different aspects of, in light of all this stuff going on, what are the one things, if you could point to one thing that you're hopeful for, optimistic of? We just talked about that with Rand Paul, the filibuster, but anything else, more of a hopeful aspect of, maybe turning the tide and changing the relation to how people view these programs?
I think a couple things. One is I think that the more economic insecurity and anxiety that people experience, the more threats there are to start cutting social programs on which huge numbers of people rely for just the most basic standard of living, like Social Security and Medicare. The more people are going to start to question not just the wisdom, but the acceptability of ongoing U.S. aggression and militarism just on economic grounds. I also think that the more people lose faith in political institutions and the more economic anxiety they experience as a result of what they perceive as endemic corruption, the more willing they're going to be to start questioning the legitimacy of the authority of these institutions, and the more motivated they're going to be to take meaningful action. Not going to the ballot box once every 4 years and voting, but marching in the street, causing disruption and arrest kind of activism that I think is a prerequisite to any real change.
I think what's really important to drive home is the executive, unchecked, doesn't limit itself. That's the nature of executive power. Ideally, you don't build an architecture for government.
Do have power. We are not in a hopeless situation. Simply by standing up and refusing to be ignorant, by letting them know we're not fooled, that false flag operations won't work on us anymore, that we're not duped.